46 years ago, a young teacher named Emily Carter vanished from her small wooden house by Lake Couching in Aurelia, Ontario, disappeared without a trace, leaving her family and the entire town in shock. Authorities at the time believed she'd left voluntarily, but with no passport, no luggage, not even a note left behind, the theory felt hollow. For decades, the case went cold, leaving only an anonymous typed letter with the words, "She's gone far away. Don't look anymore." However, in 2022, a young detective in Toronto didn't believe the old hypothesis and began retracing every small clue: the embroidered wool scarf marked EC, a Polaroid photograph hidden for decades, and DNA still lingering on the envelope's edge. What she discovered afterward would upend the entire history of the case and stun the Ontario community in a way no one could have imagined. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Aurelia, Ontario, late October 1977. A small lakeside town on Lake Couching, where you could walk from one end to the other in just 15 minutes, where cold mist always lingered around the low wooden rooftops and church bells rang steadily every evening. The smell of damp pine and wood smoke mixed in the air. Yellow streetlights trembled in the fog, casting pale halos on the water like streaks of memory. It was a seemingly ordinary Saturday evening, so quiet you could clearly hear a distant truck rumbling by. Emily Carter, a 24-year-old elementary school teacher, lived alone in a small house at the end of Cedar Street. Neighbors often saw her smiling every morning, hair neatly tied back, carrying a stack of student tests. That evening, she left the house as dusk fell, wearing a light jacket and carrying only her keys. No one knew where she was going. Only the old neighbor across the street recalled hearing the door close softly and the click of heels on the wooden porch, followed by silence. With the lights still on inside, the kitchen radio played an old Linda Ronstadt song, her voice drifting endlessly in the empty room, mingling with the wind whistling through the door cracks. On the table, a teacup still held faint warmth. A book lay open halfway beside it, one page corner folded as if she'd returned to finish reading in just a few minutes. But the night stretched on. The Carter house lights spilled onto the porch like an unblinking eye. When the church clock struck 10, Mrs. Carter, her mother, picked up the phone to call, hearing the rings echo into cold emptiness. No one answered. Half an hour later, Mr. Carter tried again. This time, only a steady dial tone. In the neighborhood, a few curious neighbors stepped onto their porches staring at the house with its light still on. One knocked on the door. No response. Wind from the lake brought mist blowing through, scattering dry maple leaves along the path. The night was eerily still, only the gentle lap of waves on the shore and the creak of the porch boards in the breeze. At dawn, as fog blanketed the streets and the sunrise hadn't yet peeked through the tree line, a phone rang in the Aurelia Police Department's duty room. The duty officer answered. A trembling voice on the other end spoke softly but firmly. "Our daughter didn't come home." In that moment, the fog thickened, as if the whole town was holding its breath before something that had just begun. The next morning, as news of Emily Carter's disappearance spread, Aurelia awoke to a completely different atmosphere. Fog still blanketed the lake, but instead of the usual peace, people heard the crackle of police radios, boots crunching on wet gravel, and search dogs barking from the northern woods. Local police mobilized their full staff, coordinating with volunteer search teams. A large map was spread across a long table in the Aurelia Police Department's makeshift meeting room. Detective Martin Beck stood at its center, marking roads and trails with red ink, his jaw set, his mind already working through what everyone feared but no one yet dared to say aloud. But to understand how a case this cold could finally be solved nearly half a century later, we need to go back to where it all began. To that October night in 1977, when the fog rolled in and Emily Carter stepped out of her door for the last time. By Sunday afternoon, Emily Carter's face was everywhere. Her photograph, the one from last year's school directory, where she wore a cream-colored blouse and smiled gently at the camera, was taped to every storefront window on Main Street. It hung on the bulletin board outside the post office, pinned to telephone poles along Cedar Street, and stacked in piles at the town hall entrance. Beneath her image, bold black letters read, "Missing, Emily Carter, 24, last seen October 22, 1977. Volunteers arrived in waves. Farmers from the surrounding townships drove in with thermoses of coffee and hunting dogs. Church groups organized into search parties, each assigned a section of the woods or stretches of shoreline. Women from the school where Emily taught gathered in the community center, fielding phone calls and coordinating supplies. The Rotary Club set up a donation table for the Carter family. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone needed to do something. Detective Martin Beck watched it all from the steps of the police station, a cigarette burning unnoticed between his fingers. He was 47, with graying temples and a face carved by 2 decades of small-town police work. Domestic disputes, drunk driving arrests, the occasional break-in. Nothing like this. He'd worked missing person cases before, but they usually ended in a day or two. A teenager sleeping off a hangover in a friend's basement. A confused elderly man wandering too far from home. This felt different. Beck took a long drag and flicked the ash into the wind. Then he turned and walked back inside. The search effort was methodical, organized, exhausting. Teams moved through the woods north of Lake Couching in straight lines, flashlights cutting through the dense underbrush even as daylight faded. Others combed the shoreline, eyes scanning for disturbed earth, discarded clothing, anything out of place. A few boats launched onto the lake itself, dragging hooks through the cold water while the mist swirled around them like ghosts. Beck coordinated from the makeshift command center, updating the map with each completed sector. He asked questions in his calm, measured way. Where was she last seen? Who saw her last? What was her state of mind? And wrote everything down in a battered notebook with a chewed pen. She wasn't the type to run. Mr. Carter had told him that first morning, voice shaking. She loved her job. She loved this town. Something happened to her. I know it. Beck had nodded, said nothing, and made a note. Parents insist foul play. No evidence of distress prior. He learned quickly that Emily was well liked. Quiet, yes. Kept to herself, certainly. But kind, thoughtful. The type of person who remembered birthdays and brought soup to neighbors when they were sick. She had no boyfriend, no known conflicts, no debts or entanglements. Her life was, by all accounts, uneventful, which made her disappearance all the more strange. On the 3rd day, they found her car. A volunteer search team, cutting through a muddy clearing 2 miles west of town near the old logging road, spotted the familiar beige Toyota Corolla parked awkwardly beneath a stand of birch tree. The front tires were sunk into soft earth. Dew clung to the windshield. Dead leaves covered the hood. Beck arrived within 20 minutes. He circled the vehicle slowly, hands in his coat pockets, eyes taking in every detail. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay Emily's brown leather wallet, her driver's license visible through the plastic window. Her denim jacket was folded neatly in the back. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. Why would she leave everything behind? One of the younger officers asked, peering through the window. Beck crouched beside the driver's door, studying the mud. Tire tracks, but nothing distinct enough to cast. Footprints, too many to separate. Rain from the past 2 nights had washed away anything useful. If she ran, Beck said quietly, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. She didn't run far. The wallet was sent for fingerprinting. The car was towed back to the station and searched inch by inch. They found nothing. No note, no sign of where she'd gone or why. Just an abandoned car in the woods, as if Emily Carter had stepped out for a walk and simply vanished into the trees. Theories began to circulate almost immediately. Some said she'd had a secret lover, someone from out of town, and had run away to start a new life. Others whispered about the lake, how it was deeper than anyone knew. how bodies could sink and never surface. A few older residents mentioned the old stories, the ones about travelers disappearing near the woods in the 1940s, though no one took that seriously. Beck kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't believe in ghost stories, and he didn't believe in secret lovers who left wallets behind. He believed in evidence. And right now, the evidence told him nothing. Then came the phone call. 4 days after Emily disappeared, on the morning of October 26th, the duty officer at the station picked up a call just before 9. The voice on the other end was male, low, deliberate. There was no emotion in it, no urgency. "Your daughter isn't missing," the voice said. "She went to Toronto. Don't look anymore." The line went dead. The officer scrambled to trace it, but the technology in 1977 wasn't fast enough. By the time the phone company responded, the call was long over. It had come from a payphone outside a gas station in Barrie, 40 minutes south. The attendant on duty didn't remember seeing anyone suspicious. Beck listened to the officer's report in silence, then asked to hear it again, word for word. "Your daughter. Not Emily. Not the missing woman. Your daughter." The caller knew the Carters, or wanted them to think he did. "Toronto," Beck muttered, tapping his pen against the desk. "Why Toronto?" No one had an answer. The days that followed became a blur of dead ends. Tips poured in from across the province. Someone thought they'd seen Emily at a bus station in Aurelia. Another swore she'd been spotted at a diner near Sudbury. Each lead was followed. Each one fizzled into nothing. A woman matching her description had checked into a motel in Toronto, but it turned out to be someone else entirely. A hitchhiker seen near Highway 11 was later identified as a teenager from North Bay. Beck worked 16-hour days, drinking cold coffee and smoking too many cigarettes. His wife stopped asking when he'd be home. The map in the meeting room grew crowded with pins and circles, a visual representation of futility. And through it all, the fog kept rolling in. The emotional toll on the Carter family was unbearable. Mrs. Carter stopped sleeping. Every night she sat in the chair by the living room window, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the street as if Emily might walk up the path at any moment. Her husband tried to coax her to bed, but she refused. "What if she comes home and I'm not here?" she whispered. Mr. Carter aged 10 years and 10 days. His hands shook when he poured his coffee. He stopped going to work at the hardware store. Neighbors brought casseroles that went uneaten. The house, once warm and welcoming, became a mausoleum of waiting. Beck visited them often, though he had little to report. He sat with them in their quiet living room, where Emily's school photo still hung on the wall beside her younger brothers, and he promised them he wouldn't give up. But privately, he was beginning to lose hope. Then one afternoon, flipping through his notes, Beck paused on a name he'd underlined weeks earlier. Mark Holloway, the mechanic on Forest Hill Road. Emily had taken her car to him a few days before she disappeared. Routine brake work, nothing unusual. Holloway had been cooperative during the initial questioning, calm and polite. He said Emily had picked up the car on the afternoon of October 20th, paid in cash, thanked him and left. He hadn't seen her since. Beck pulled the interview transcript and read it again. Q. What time did Miss Carter leave your shop? A. Around 5:30, I think. Maybe closer to 6. Q. Did she seem upset? Distracted? A. No, she seemed fine, normal. Q. Where were you the evening of October 22nd? A. Home, alone, watched some TV, went to bed early. Q. Anyone who can confirm that? A. No, I live alone. Beck circled the words, no. I live alone, and wrote in the margin, no alibi after 6:30. Watch Holloway. He didn't know why. Instinct, maybe? Or just the habit of a cop who'd learned that the calmest voices sometimes hid the loudest secrets. He made a note to follow up, then set the file aside. By mid-November, the search parties had stopped. The volunteers went home. The posters faded and peeled in the rain. The police switchboard went quiet. The case remained open, but the momentum was gone. Winter was coming, and Aurelia had to keep living. Beck stood alone one evening by the edge of Lake Couching, watching the fog roll in just as it had the night Emily disappeared. The water was black and still, reflecting nothing. Somewhere out there, he thought, was the answer. Somewhere in this town, maybe in a file, maybe in a memory, maybe in a lie someone had told and believed long enough to forget it was a lie, was the truth. But for now, all he had was fog, and silence, and a name in his notebook that wouldn't leave him alone. 3 months later, the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in early March 1978, when the snow had finally begun to melt and the first hints of spring crept into the air. Mrs. Carter found it tucked inside the mailbox, wedged between a utility bill and a grocery store circular. There was no stamp, no postmark, no return address. Just her name, Mrs. Helen Carter, typed across the front of a plain white envelope. Her hands trembled as she carried it inside. Mr. Carter was at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He looked up when she entered, saw the envelope in her shaking hands, and immediately stood. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She sat down slowly, placed the envelope on the table between them, and stared at it as if it might explode. He reached for it first. The paper was thick, heavier than ordinary stationery, almost like cardstock. It had been cut cleanly along the edges, precise and deliberate. Mr. Carter slid his thumb under the flap and opened it carefully, as if preserving evidence he didn't yet know he'd need. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. He unfolded it. The message was typed in the center, each letter struck hard enough to leave slight indentations on the back of the page. The alignment was slightly off, the way old typewriters sometimes drifted to the left. The ink was dark, heavy, unmistakable. It read, "She's gone far away. Don't look anymore. No signature, no punctuation beyond the period, no explanation." Mrs. Carter read it over her husband's shoulder and made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, before covering her mouth with both hands. Mr. Carter read it 3 times, his jaw tightening with each pass. Then he stood, picked up the phone, and called Detective Beck. Beck arrived within the hour. He stood in the Carter's kitchen, the letter spread flat on the table in front of him, and studied it in silence. His face gave nothing away, but his mind was already racing. The paper was expensive, not the kind you'd find at a drugstore. This was bond paper, the sort used in offices or by professionals. The typing was clean but imperfect, done on a manual typewriter, likely a Remington or an Underwood based on the serif font and spacing. Whoever wrote this had access to an office or owned their own machine. "When did you find this?" Beck asked, still looking at the letter. "This morning," Mr. Carter said. "Around 8:30. It was just there, in the mailbox." "No postage," Beck noted aloud. "It was hand-delivered." Mrs. Carter's breath hitched. "Someone was at our house." Beck nodded slowly. "Sometime last night or early this morning. Did you hear anything? See anyone unfamiliar in the neighborhood?" They both shook their heads. Beck pulled a plastic evidence bag from his coat pocket and carefully slid the letter and envelope inside. "I'm going to have this analyzed. Don't touch anything else that might have come with it." "What does it mean?" Mrs. Carter whispered. "She's gone far away. Does that mean she's alive?" Beck met her eyes and saw the desperate hope there, fragile as glass. He wanted to tell her yes. He wanted to give her something to hold on to. But he'd been a cop long enough to know that hope could be a weapon, too. "I don't know yet," he said gently. "But I'm going to find out." Back at the station, Beck laid the letter under a desk lamp and examined it with a magnifying glass. The paper revealed nothing. No watermarks, no smudges, no stray fibers. The typing was uniform, no errors or strikeouts. Whoever had written this had been deliberate, methodical. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment message. It had been planned. He called in a forensic technician from the provincial lab in Toronto, a wiry man named Dalton, who arrived the next day with a briefcase full of powders and chemicals. Dalton dusted the paper for fingerprints, working slowly under Beck's watchful eye. After 20 minutes, he leaned back and sighed. "There's a partial thumbprint here on the top edge," Dalton said, pointing with a gloved finger. "But it's badly smudged. Not enough ridge detail to match against anything. Can you lift it?" "I can try. But even if I do, unless you've got a suspect to compare it to, it's not going to tell you much." Beck nodded grimly. In 1977, fingerprint databases were limited, mostly regional. Without a suspect, a partial print was nearly useless. "What about the envelope?" Beck asked. Dalton examined the adhesive flap under ultraviolet light, then shook his head. "Nothing viable. If there's saliva here, it's degraded or too faint to test. We don't have the technology to pull DNA from something this minimal. Not yet, anyway." Beck felt the frustration settle in his chest like a stone. In another decade, maybe two, this letter could crack the case wide open. But in 1978, it was just a taunt, a message designed to hurt without giving anything away. "Bag it," Beck said quietly. "I want it preserved. Everything." "You think this is going somewhere eventually?" Dalton asked. Beck stared at the letter, at those typed words that felt like they'd been burned into his brain. "She's gone far away. Don't look anymore." "Yeah," Beck said. "I do." But the bureaucracy didn't agree. 2 weeks later, Beck sat in a meeting with his captain and a representative from the provincial police, both of whom had reviewed the case file and the letter. "There's no evidence of foul play," the captain said, tapping a pen against the folder. "No body, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. The car was abandoned, yes, but nothing about the scene suggests violence." "The letter," Beck started. "The letter could be from anyone," the provincial rep interrupted. "A prank. Someone with a sick sense of humor. Or even from Miss Carter herself, trying to get her family to stop searching." Beck's jaw tightened. "She wouldn't do that." "You don't know that, Detective. I know her family. I know this town. This isn't a prank." The captain leaned forward, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Martin, I understand your instinct here, but without evidence we can't justify keeping this as an active investigation. We've exhausted every lead. The search turned up nothing. The letter gives us no actionable information." Beck felt the walls closing in. "So what are you saying?" "We're classifying it as a possible voluntary disappearance," the captain said. "The case stays open, but it goes cold. If new evidence surfaces, we'll revisit it. But for now, we move on." Beck stood abruptly, the chair scraping loud against the floor. "She didn't leave voluntarily," he said, voice low and hard. "Someone knows what happened, and whoever wrote that letter knows exactly where she is." No one responded. Beck walked out. The Carters were devastated. When Beck delivered the news in their living room, that the case was being shelved, that the official stance was Emily had likely left on her own, Mrs. Carter collapsed into sobs. Mr. Carter just stared at the floor, his hands folded tightly in his lap, knuckles white. "They think she abandoned us," Mrs. Carter choked out. "They think she just walked away." "I don't believe that," Beck said firmly. "And I'm not giving up." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Without the department's resources, without active manpower, the case would fade. Aurelia would move on. The fog would keep rolling in, and eventually people would stop asking questions. And they did. By summer, the whispers had turned inward. Neighbors who once united in search efforts now eyed each other with suspicion. Who had seen Emily last? Who had access to a typewriter? Who lived alone with no alibi? Accusations were never spoken aloud, but they lingered in glances, in conversations that stopped when certain people entered a room. The mechanic, Mark Holloway, felt it most. People stopped bringing their cars to his shop. Some crossed the street when they saw him coming. He never complained. Never defended himself. He just kept working head down alone in his garage on Forest Hill Road. Years passed. The letter was filed away in a manila folder, sealed in plastic, and stored in a metal cabinet in the evidence room. The case number, 7704EC, was written in faded black ink on the tab. Beck retired in 1989. On his last day, he pulled the file one more time, read the letter again, and placed it back with the others. He never stopped thinking about it, and somewhere in Aurelia someone else never forgot either, because the person who typed those words, "She's gone far away, don't look anymore," knew they were a lie, and for nearly half a century, they'd lived with that secret, buried as deeply as the truth itself. Mark Holloway had lived in Aurelia his entire life. He was born in the small clapboard house on Forest Hill Road in 1945, raised by a father who worked the lumber mills and a mother who died when he was 12. By 16, he was already working under the hood of his father's pickup truck, learning to diagnose problems by sound alone. By 20, he'd opened Holloway Auto Repair in the garage behind that same house, a hand-painted sign swinging from a rust-stained post. People trusted him. He was the kind of man who'd stay late to finish a job, who'd knock $10 off the bill if you were short, who remembered your kids' names and asked how they were doing in school. His hands were always stained with grease. His shirts always smelled faintly of oil and cigarette smoke, and his voice was quiet, so quiet you had to lean in to hear him sometimes. In a town like Aurelia, that counted for something. So when Detective Beck showed up at the garage 3 days after Emily Carter disappeared asking questions, people noticed. It was late afternoon, the sky gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Beck parked his cruiser outside the garage and found Holloway bent over the engine of a Chevy Nova, a wrench in one hand and a rag in the other. "Mr. Holloway?" Holloway straightened slowly, wiping his hands on the rag before turning to face Beck. He was 32 then, lean and wiry, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges and pale blue eyes that gave nothing away. "Detective," Holloway said evenly. "What can I do for you?" Beck pulled out his notebook. "I'm following up on Emily Carter's disappearance. I understand she brought her car in here recently." Holloway nodded. "Yeah, about a week ago. Brake work." "When exactly?" "Let me check." Holloway walked to a small desk cluttered with invoices and flipped through a stack of carbon copy receipts. He pulled one out and handed it to Beck. "October 20th. She picked it up that afternoon." Beck scanned the receipt. It was neat, professional, filled out in Holloway's cramped handwriting. "What time did she leave?" "Around 5:30, maybe closer to 6. Holloway leaned against the workbench, arms crossed loosely. "Paid in cash, thanked me. That was it." "How did she seem?" "Fine. Normal." Holloway's expression didn't change. She asked if the brakes would hold through winter. I told her they would. She smiled, said thanks and left. Beck studied him. Holloway's voice was calm, his posture relaxed. He answered every question without hesitation, without defensiveness. Most people got nervous when a cop questioned them, even if they had nothing to hide. Holloway didn't. "Where were you the evening of October 22nd? "Home. Alone." Holloway gestured toward the house behind the garage. "Watched some TV, went to bed early. I usually do." "Anyone who can confirm that?" "No. I live alone." Beck wrote that down, underlining the last two words. "You and Miss Carter ever talk about anything besides car trouble?" Holloway shook his head. "Not really. She was polite, quiet. We didn't chat much." "Ever see her outside of work? At the store, the church, anywhere?" "Sure. It's a small town. You see everyone." Holloway paused, then added, "But I didn't know her personally, if that's what you're asking." Beck closed his notebook and looked at Holloway for a long moment. There was something about him, something in the flatness of his tone, the stillness of his posture, that felt off. Not guilty necessarily, just absent, like he was watching the conversation from a distance. "If you think of anything else, you'll let me know." "Of course." Beck nodded and walked back to his car. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Holloway stood in the doorway of the garage, hands in his pockets, watching him leave. That night, Beck added a note to his file. No alibi after 6:30. Watch Holloway. He didn't know why, just instinct. But instinct wasn't evidence. Over the following weeks, Beck kept an eye on Holloway, discreetly from a distance. He drove past the garage more often than necessary, watched for unusual activity, asked around about Holloway's reputation. Everyone said the same thing. Mark's a good guy. Quiet, sure, but solid. Wouldn't hurt a fly. Even Emily's father, when Beck mentioned Holloway's name, shook his head. Mark fixed our car a few times. Always fair, always honest. I can't imagine him being involved. Beck didn't push it. Without evidence, suspicion was just noise. And in a small town, noise traveled fast. By the time the letter arrived in March, some people had started to wonder aloud why Beck kept circling back to Holloway. A few muttered that the detective was grasping at straws, seeing shadows where there were none. He's desperate, one regular at the diner said. Needs someone to blame. Poor Mark, another added. Getting dragged into this just because he fixed her car. Holloway himself never commented. He kept his head down, did his work, and stayed out of sight. But the damage was done. Business at the garage slowed. People still came, but not as many. Some brought their cars to Barry instead, driving an extra 20 minutes to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of wondering. Beck noticed. And he hated it. Because the truth was, he didn't know if Holloway was guilty. He just knew something didn't sit right. And in the absence of answers, doubt was all he had. The years passed slowly after that. The case stayed cold. Beck worked other investigations, burglaries, domestic disputes, the occasional drunken disorderly. But Emily Carter's file sat on the corner of his desk, always within reach, always unfinished. He retired in the spring of 1989, 2 months after his 60th birthday. On his last day, the station held a small gathering in the break room. Cake, weak coffee, a few handshakes and awkward speeches. Beck thanked them, smiled politely, and left as soon as he could. Before he walked out the door, he stopped by the evidence room. The clerk, a young officer named Davis, looked up from his paperwork. Need something, detective? Just one more look. Davis nodded and unlocked the metal cabinet. Beck found the file easily, 7704 EC, and pulled it out. He flipped through the pages, the photos, the letter sealed in plastic. He read the words one more time. She's gone far away. Don't look anymore. Then he closed the file and handed it back. You ever solve this one? Davis asked. Beck shook his head. No. Think you ever will? Beck was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Someone will. He walked out into the pale afternoon light, climbed into his truck, and drove home. He never set foot in the station again. That same evening, Mark Holloway sat on the back porch of his house, a bottle of beer sweating in his hand. The fog was rolling in off Lake Couching, slow and thick, the way it always did in spring. It moved through the trees like something alive, curling around the trunks, swallowing the light. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Holloway watched it in silence. He hadn't thought about Emily Carter in months, not consciously anyway. But sometimes late at night when the wind picked up and rattled the loose shingles on the garage roof, he'd hear her voice in his memory. Quiet. Polite. Thank you, Mark. He took a long drink and set the bottle down on the railing. The fog thickened. The lake disappeared. The town disappeared. And for a moment it felt like the world had shrunk to nothing but him and the mist and the weight of something he never spoke aloud. He sat there until the cold drove him inside. Aurelia moved on. The Carter house stood empty for years after Mrs. Carter passed in 1995 and Mr. Carter followed 6 months later. Their grief, it seemed, had been all that held them together. The house was sold eventually, bought by a family from Toronto who didn't know the story. The porch light was replaced. The garden was replanted. Life continued. People stopped talking about Emily Carter. Her name became a footnote, a sad memory, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about being careful at night. Mark Holloway stayed in Aurelia. He kept the garage running, though he never expanded, never advertised. He grew older, grayer, quieter. People still brought their cars to him, though fewer than before. He didn't seem to mind. And in the basement of the Aurelia Police Department, in a metal filing cabinet that no one opened anymore, Emily Carter's case file gathered dust. The letter remained sealed in plastic, the photographs yellowed at the edges. The note Beck had written, "No alibi after 6:30. Watch Holloway sat on the second page, ink fading but still legible. And for 45 years, the file waited for someone to care enough to look again, waited for technology to catch up to truth, waited for the fog to finally lift. Toronto, Ontario, October 2022. Detective Ava Nguyen sat alone in her office on the third floor of the Ontario Cold Case Unit, the glow of her computer screen the only light in the room. Outside, the city hummed with late-night traffic, but up here, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that let her think. She was 34, sharp-featured and sharp-minded, with dark hair pulled back in a perpetual ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. Her colleagues called her relentless. Her captain called her obsessive. Ava called it thorough. She'd been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years now, and in that time she'd closed 7 cases that others had given up on. A hit and run from 1998, a home invasion from 2004, a missing teenager from 2011, whose remains were finally identified through familial DNA. She had a talent for seeing what others overlooked, for finding the thread no one else thought to pull. Tonight, she was supposed to be reviewing a case from 2006, but her mind kept wandering. She minimized the file and opened the digital archive instead, scrolling aimlessly through the database of unsolved cases. Thousands of them, stretching back decades. Some had been scanned from paper files, others were born digital, all of them waiting. Her cursor hovered over a folder labeled 1970s, Southwestern Ontario. She clicked. The list loaded slowly, dozens of names, dates, summaries. Most were homicides, a few were suspicious deaths, and scattered among them were missing persons cases that had never been resolved. One name caught her eye. Carter, Emily, 1977. Aurelia, on, missing person. Ava frowned. She didn't recognize the name, didn't remember reading about it in training. She clicked the folder. The file opened, scanned police reports, photographs, witness statements, evidence logs, and near the top, flagged with a red marker, was a scanned image of a typed letter. Ava leaned closer, reading the words, "She's gone far away. Don't look anymore." Something about the phrasing made her pause. Not she left. Not she's safe. But she's gone far away. It felt deliberate, controlled, almost possessive. Ava scrolled through the rest of the file. The car found abandoned. The wallet left behind. The search that turned up nothing. The case eventually classified as a possible voluntary disappearance. But then she saw the note from the lead detective, a man named Martin Beck. No alibi after 6:30. Watch Holloway. She sat back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. A letter, a suspect, and a case that had been cold for 45 years. "Let's see what you've been hiding," Ava murmured. The next morning, Ava drove to the Provincial Evidence Archive in Mississauga, a nondescript concrete building that smelled of dust and old paper. She signed in, filled out a request form, and waited. 20 minutes later, a clerk wheeled out a metal cart with a single cardboard box labeled Aurelia PD, 1977-04 EC. Ava carried it to a table in the corner and opened it carefully. Inside were the original case files, yellowed paper, faded ink, photographs with curled edges, and at the bottom, sealed in a plastic evidence bag, was the envelope. She lifted it gently, holding it up to the light. The paper was thick, heavier than modern stationery, and had aged to a pale cream color. The edges were slightly browned, the corners soft from decades of storage. The address, Mrs. Helen Carter, was still visible, typed in the same heavy ink as the letter inside. Ava turned it over. The flap had been sealed with adhesive, then opened carefully by the original investigators. She could see where they'd dusted it for fingerprints, leaving faint traces of powder along the edges. But they hadn't tested it for DNA. In 1978, they couldn't. The technology didn't exist. But now, Ava thought, we have a chance. She submitted the envelope to the Center of Forensic Sciences later that day, along with a detailed request for next-generation DNA sequencing. The lab technician, a woman named Dr. Patel, raised an eyebrow when she saw the date on the evidence tags. 1977, Patel said. That's ambitious. Can you do it? Ava asked. Patel examined the envelope under a magnifying lamp, studying the adhesive strip. There's degradation, obviously, but if there's any biological material left, saliva, skin cells, anything, we might be able to extract it. No guarantees, though. I'll take might, Ava said. Patel smiled faintly. Give me 3 weeks. Ava spent those 3 weeks diving deeper into the case. She tracked down everything she could find on Emily Carter: school records, employment history, interviews with surviving family friends. Emily had been quiet, well-liked, unremarkable in all the ways that made her disappearance so strange. No enemies, no debts, no reason to vanish. Then Ava turned her attention to Mark Holloway. He was still alive, 77 years old, living in Barrie. She found property records, tax filings, and a few mentions in local news archives. He'd kept the garage running until 2010, then sold it and retired. No criminal record, no red flags. But Beck's note kept nagging at her. Watch Holloway. Why? What had Beck seen that the file didn't show? She made a list of questions. She prepared interview strategies. She waited, and then, on a gray Tuesday morning in early November, her phone rang. Detective Nguyen, it's Dr. Patel. We got results. Ava's pulse quickened. She grabbed a pen. Go ahead. We were able to extract 2 DNA profiles from the envelope adhesive. One is female, consistent with the victim, Emily Carter. We matched it against a hair sample that was in the evidence box. And the other? Male, unknown. But we ran it through the provincial and national databases, and we got a partial familial match. Ava's hand froze mid-note. Familial? Yes. The profile doesn't match anyone in the system directly, but it's genetically consistent with the Holloway family line. We cross-referenced it with samples from a couple of distant relatives who'd submitted DNA for ancestry testing. The match is strong enough to suggest a close male relative, father, brother, or son. Ava's breath caught. Mark Holloway, she whispered. That would be my guess, Patel said, but you'll need a direct sample to confirm. Ava hung up and sat very still, staring at the file spread across her desk. After 45 years, after decades of silence, of dead ends, of a letter that had taunted investigators, and a name that had lingered in the margins of an old detective's notebook. After all of it, a single molecule had survived, and it was pointing directly at the man Beck had suspected all along. That evening, Ava stood at the window of her office, watching the lights of Toronto flicker to life against the darkening sky. She thought about Emily Carter, 24 years old, smiling in a school photo, folding the corner of a book she'd never finish. She thought about the Carters waiting by the window for a daughter who never came home. She thought about Beck, spending his last day at the station staring at a file he couldn't solve. And she thought about Mark Holloway, living quietly in Barrie for nearly half a century, carrying a secret no one had been able to prove. Until now. Ava picked up her phone and dialed her captain. I need a warrant, she said, and I need a team. We're reopening the Emily Carter case. There was a pause on the other end. Then, you sure about this? Ava looked down at the file, at the letter sealed in plastic, at Beck's note underlined in fading ink. I'm sure, she said. She hung up and whispered into the quiet of the empty office. After all these years, 45 years of silence, broken by a molecule, and the truth, buried for so long, was finally beginning to surface. Ava spent the next 2 weeks buried in research. She pulled every record she could find on Mark Holloway: property deeds, business licenses, tax returns, utility bills. She studied old maps of Aurelia, tracing the layout of Forest Hill Road in 1977, comparing it to satellite images from today. She requested police transcripts from the original investigation, reading Beck's handwritten notes until she could practically hear his voice in the margins. She found photographs, too. Holloway at 20, leaning against a truck with grease-stained hands. Holloway at 35, standing in front of his garage, arms crossed, face unreadable. And one from 2010, the year he sold the property. Older, grayer, but still that same flat, emotionless expression. The more Ava learned, the more convinced she became that Beck had been right. There was something about Holloway, something careful, something hidden. She just needed to find it. On a cold Monday morning in late November, Ava drove north to Aurelia. The town looked smaller than she'd imagined, quiet and faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Main Street was lined with old storefronts, half of them empty now, windows soap-streaked and dark. The church still stood at the center of town, its white steeple piercing the gray sky. And beyond it, barely visible through the trees, Lake Couching stretched out like a sheet of hammered steel. Ava parked near the town hall and walked the streets slowly, taking it in. The fog that Beck had described in his reports was there, clinging low to the ground, rolling in off the water. It felt like the town hadn't changed in 50 years, like it had been waiting. She stopped at a small diner on Main Street, its neon sign flickering weakly. Inside, a handful of locals sat at the counter, nursing coffee and talking in low voices. They all turned to look when she walked in. Ava ordered coffee and sat at a booth by the window. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda, brought it over. "Just passing through?" Linda asked. "Not exactly," Ava said. She pulled out her badge. "I'm with the Ontario Cold Case Unit. I'm looking into the Emily Carter case." The diner went quiet. Linda's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or unease. She glanced back at the counter, where the other patrons had stopped talking and were now watching. "That was a long time ago," Linda said carefully. "I know, but I think there's more to the story." Linda didn't respond. She refilled Ava's coffee and walked away. Ava stayed for an hour, trying to strike up conversations, but no one wanted to talk. A few muttered polite excuses and left. Others just avoided eye contact. It was clear. Aurelia didn't want to remember Emily Carter. Or maybe it was afraid to. Later that afternoon, Ava stood outside Holloway's old garage on Forest Hill Road. The property had changed hands twice since Holloway sold it in 2010. The current owner, a mechanic named Davis, had agreed to let Ava search the premises after she'd explained the situation and secured a warrant. "You really think something's buried here?" Davis asked, standing beside her with his arms crossed. "I don't know," Ava admitted, "but I have to check." She'd brought a team with her, 2 forensic technicians and an operator with a ground-penetrating radar unit. The machine looked like a lawnmower with a screen attached, designed to detect anomalies beneath the surface. Voids, dense objects, anything that didn't belong. They started in the garage itself, a large concrete space that still smelled faintly of oil. The operator moved the GPR slowly across the floor, watching the screen as it mapped the layers beneath. For 20 minutes there was nothing. Then the machine pinged. The operator stopped, backed up, and ran the scanner over the same spot again. The ping repeated, sharper this time, more insistent. "There's something here," he said, tapping the screen. Above 3 feet down, dense material, non-uniform. Ava's pace quickened. "Mark it." They used spray paint to outline the area. A rough rectangle, about 4 feet by 2 feet, near the back corner of the garage where a workbench used to stand. "We'll need jackhammers," one of the technicians said. "Do it," Ava said. The excavation took most of the next day. They broke through the concrete carefully, piece by piece, until they reached the dirt beneath. Then they switched to shovels and brushes, working slowly, methodically, the way archaeologists unearthed fragile remains. Ava stood nearby watching, her arms crossed against the cold. The fog had rolled in again, thick and damp, pressing against the garage doors. And then one of the technicians called out, "I've got something." Ava moved closer. The technician was crouched over the hole, brushing dirt away from a patch of dark fabric. Slowly, carefully, she lifted it free. It was a scarf. Woolen, burgundy, mud-stained and faded, but still intact. And in the corner, embroidered in pale thread, were two initials. EC. Ava's breath caught. She knelt beside the technician and took the scarf in her gloved hands, holding it as if it might disintegrate. The fabric was heavy with dried mud, rough to the touch. But the stitching was still clear, the letters still legible. Emily Carter. "Bag it," Ava said quietly. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. The technician nodded and slipped the scarf into an evidence bag. But before she sealed it, Ava looked closer and noticed something else. A small metallic object caught in the fabric. "What is that?" The technician pulled it free with tweezers. It was a screw, rusted, coated in flecks of paint. Beige paint. Ava's mind raced. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the case file until she found what she was looking for. A photograph of Mark Holloway's 1976 Ford F-100 truck, parked outside the garage in an old evidence photo. The truck was beige. "Run the paint," Ava said, her voice tight. "I want to know if it matches that truck." The results came back 3 days later. The paint on the screw was a direct match to the automotive paint used on 1976 Ford F-100 trucks, specifically the beige color listed as desert tan. And the soil clinging to the scarf? It matched sediment samples taken from the shoreline of Lake Couching, the same place Emily Carter's car had been found in 1977. Ava sat in her hotel room in Barrie, staring at the lab report, and felt the pieces click into place. Emily had been at the lake. The scarf had been buried in Holloway's garage, and the screw tied both to Holloway's truck. She hadn't run away. She'd never left Aurelia. That evening, Ava drove back to the lake. She parked at the edge of Cedar Street, where Emily's house had once stood, now replaced by a newer home with vinyl siding and a neat front lawn. But the street was the same. The trees were the same. And the fog, rolling in off the water, was identical to the fog that had been there 45 years ago. Ava walked down to the shore and stood at the water's edge, hands in her pockets, watching the mist curl across the surface. She thought about Emily. 24 years old, walking out of her house that October night, keys in hand, trusting that the world was safe. She thought about the scarf, buried beneath concrete for decades, waiting to be found. And she thought about Mark Holloway, living just blocks away, watching the same fog roll in every night, carrying the weight of what he'd done. Ava closed her eyes and whispered into the wind. "You never left, did you?" The lake was silent, but the answer was already clear. Emily Carter had never gone far away. She'd been here all along, buried, hidden, silenced, and the town, whether it knew or not, had kept her secret. Ava turned and walked back to her car, her jaw set, her mind already moving to the next step. It was time to confront Mark Holloway, and this time, the truth wouldn't be buried. The name appeared in a footnote. Ava had been cross-referencing property records from Holloway's garage when she noticed it. A business license filed in 1975 listing 2 owners, Mark Holloway and Samuel Granger. She sat forward in her chair, frowning. Samuel Granger. She'd never seen that name in the original case file. Beck had never mentioned a partner, but according to the records, Granger had co-owned Holloway Auto Repair for 3 years before the business was transferred solely to Holloway in 1978, 1 year after Emily disappeared. Ava pulled up Granger's information and found something else. A missing person report filed in February 1980. Samuel Granger, age 35, last seen leaving his home in Aurelia. No known destination. No body ever found. The report was thin, barely 2 pages. There had been a brief investigation, but it led nowhere. Granger had been in debt, according to neighbors. Some said he'd talked about leaving town, starting over somewhere else. The case was classified as a voluntary disappearance and closed within 6 months. But Ava didn't believe in coincidences. 2 men connected to Emily Carter. One still alive. The other vanished 3 years after she did. She needed to know more. Ava spent the next morning digging through old police records and newspaper archives. She found a few mentions of Granger in the local paper. A notice about the garage opening in 1975. A brief mention of a bar fight in 1978 where he'd been cited for disorderly conduct. And then, in early 1980, a small article buried on page 6, Local Man Missing, Family Appeals for Information. The article included a grainy photograph. Samuel Granger, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, standing beside a pickup truck. He looked rough around the edges, unshaven, a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes narrowed against the sun. Ava zoomed in on the photo. Behind Granger, barely visible in the background, was another man, Mark Holloway. She printed the image and added it to her growing file. Then she found something else. An interview Beck had conducted with a bartender from Aurelia in late 1977, just after Emily disappeared. The bartender had mentioned seeing Granger and Holloway together the week before Emily vanished, arguing in the parking lot outside the bar. They were shouting about something, the bartender had said. Couldn't make out the words. But Sam looked pissed. Mark just stood there, calm as ever. It was strange. Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. A falling out, debts, a disappearance, and a garage where Emily's scarf had been buried. She picked up her phone and called the Aurelia property office. I need an address for Samuel Granger. Last known residence, 1980. The house was at the edge of town, nearly hidden by overgrown trees and waist-high weeds. Ava parked on the gravel driveway and stared at the structure. It was small, a single-story bungalow with peeling paint and sagging eaves. The windows were boarded up, the front porch half collapsed. It looked like no one had been inside in decades. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out of the car. The air was cold and damp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Fog clung to the ground, swirling around her boots as she walked toward the door. The wood was rotted, the lock long since rusted through. She pushed, and the door creaked open. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and decay. Ava swept her flashlight across the room. Dust covered everything, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, boxes stacked in corners, newspapers scattered across the floor. The dates on the papers were from 1979, 1980, frozen in time. She moved slowly through the rooms, stepping carefully over debris. In the kitchen, the sink was filled with stagnant water. In the bedroom, a mattress lay stripped and stained on a rusted frame. Photographs hung crookedly on the walls. Snapshots of Granger at the garage, Granger with friends, Granger standing beside Holloway in front of a truck. Ava paused at that one, studying it closely. Both men were younger, smiling faintly. But even in the photo, there was something off about the way they stood. Too stiff, too distant, like partners who didn't trust each other. She moved to the living room and knelt beside the floorboards. Some were loose, warped by time and moisture. She pulled at one, and it came free easily. Beneath it was a hollow space, and inside the hollow space was a metal box. Ava's hands trembled as she lifted the box out. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, with a rusted latch that resisted at first before finally popping open. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, were a handful of items: an old wallet with a few bills still inside, a set of keys, and a Polaroid photograph. Ava pulled the photograph free and held it up to the light. Her breath stopped. The image showed the interior of a car, Emily Carter's Toyota Corolla, based on the beige upholstery visible in the frame. And in the center of the photo, visible through the windshield, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth was open as if she'd been caught mid-scream or mid-breath. Her hands were pressed against the glass, and in the reflection of the windshield, barely visible but unmistakable, was the silhouette of a man holding a camera. Ava turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, was a single word: proof. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just evidence of Emily's abduction. This was a trophy, a record, something kept deliberately, hidden away, preserved. She sealed the photo in an evidence bag and immediately called the lab. "I need DNA analysis on a Polaroid," she said. "Priority. I need it yesterday." The results came back 48 hours later. Dr. Patel's voice was calm but firm. "We extracted epithelial cells from the surface of the photograph, likely transferred from whoever handled it frequently. The DNA profile is male, and it's a direct match to the sample we pulled from the envelope." Ava closed her eyes. "Mark Holloway." "Yes." Ava thanked her and hung up. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the photograph on her desk. Emily's terrified face, the reflection of the man who'd taken her, the word on the back: proof. And then it clicked. Samuel Granger hadn't disappeared in 1980 because he ran away. He'd disappeared because he knew too much. Ava could see it now, the partnership that had soured, the argument in the parking lot, the debts that Granger had racked up. Maybe he'd tried to blackmail Holloway. Maybe he'd threatened to talk. Or maybe Holloway had simply decided that loose ends needed to be tied up. Either way, Granger was gone. And just like Emily, no one had looked hard enough to find out why. That night, Ava stood in her hotel room, staring out at the lights of Barrie. She thought about Emily Carter, terrified in the front seat of her own car, her last moments captured on film by the man she'd trusted to fix her brakes. She thought about Samuel Granger, buried somewhere unknown, silenced before he could speak. And she thought about Mark Holloway, living quietly for 45 years, carrying secrets that should have crushed him but somehow hadn't. 2 people dead, 2 lives erased, and 1 man who'd walked free. Until now. Ava picked up her phone and texted her captain. "We have enough. I want an arrest warrant for Mark Holloway. Murder." The reply came seconds later. Approved. Move when ready. Ava set the phone down and looked back out the window. She whispered into the darkness. The truth wasn't lost. It was buried. But not anymore. Tomorrow she would dig it up, and Mark Holloway's 45 years of silence would finally end. March 2023, Barrie, Ontario. The operation was scheduled for 6 in the morning when the streets were still empty, and the sky was the color of slate. Ava stood in the parking lot of the Barrie Police Department, her breath misting in the cold air, watching as the tactical team geared up. 4 officers in vests, 2 unmarked cars, 1 warrant signed by a judge who'd read the case file and called it long overdue. Ava wore plainclothes, dark jeans, a navy jacket, her badge clipped to her belt. She'd barely slept. Her mind kept circling back to the photograph, to Emily's terrified face, to the words scrawled on the back: proof. The team leader, a sergeant named Kovach, approached her with a tablet showing the satellite view of Holloway's property. "Small bungalow on North Sundale Road," Kovach said. "Single occupant. No known weapons, no history of violence. But given the age of the case and what we're alleging, we're not taking chances." Ava nodded. "He won't run." Kovach raised an eyebrow. "You sound sure." "I am." Ava looked up at the lightening sky. "He's been waiting for this." They arrived at the house just as dawn broke. The bungalow sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, modest and unremarkable. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the driveway clear of snow. A single light glowed in the front window, The convoy parked 2 houses down. Ava stayed back as the tactical team moved into position, 2 officers at the front door, 2 at the back. Kovac gave the signal. They knocked. "Mark Holloway, Barrie Police, we have a warrant." Silence. Kovac knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Holloway, open the door." And then slowly, the lock turned. The door opened. Mark Holloway stood in the doorway, backlit by the soft glow of the living room. He was 77 now, thin and gray, his face deeply lined. He wore a flannel shirt and old jeans, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He looked at the officers with no surprise, no alarm. Just a quiet, almost resigned stillness. "I've been expecting you," he said softly. They brought him outside without resistance. Holloway moved slowly, stiffly as one of the officers guided him toward the cruiser. His hands were cuffed in front, gentle, respectful, as if arresting an elderly man required a different kind of care. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just walked. Ava stepped forward as they reached the car. "Mr. Holloway," she said. "I'm Detective Ava Newen, Ontario Cold Case Unit. You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter." Holloway looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his pale blue eyes. Not fear, not anger, something else. Recognition, maybe, or relief. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Do you understand the charges?" "I understand." Kovac started to guide him into the back seat, but Ava stopped him. "Wait." She stepped closer to Holloway, lowering her voice. "I need to ask you something." Holloway tilted his head slightly, waiting. "Why did you keep it quiet all these years?" Ava asked. "You lived in that town. You saw her parents. You watched them suffer. Why didn't you ever say anything?" For a long moment, Holloway said nothing. He looked past her toward the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pale orange and gray. Then, softly, almost thoughtfully, he said, "If she went far away, why has no one seen her?" Ava felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a question. It was an answer. The same words from the letter, spoken aloud for the first time in 45 years. A confession wrapped in a riddle. A final act of control, even now, even as the cuffs tightened around his wrists. Holloway looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "I think you already know the answer, Detective." Ava stared at him, her jaw tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. He'd just confessed. Not in words a prosecutor could easily use, but in the only way he knew how, cryptic, deliberate, leaving just enough unsaid to maintain the illusion that he still held the power. But she understood. Emily Carter had never gone far away. She'd been buried in silence, hidden in concrete, kept as a secret that only Mark Holloway had carried. And now finally he was letting it go. Kovac guided Holloway into the back seat of the cruiser and closed the door. The sound echoed in the still morning air. Ava stood on the driveway, watching as the car pulled away, red and blue lights flashing silently against the pale houses. She didn't move until the convoy disappeared around the corner, leaving only the faint hum of engines fading into the distance. Behind her, Kovac approached. "You good?" he asked. Ava nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Yeah, I'm good." That thing he said, about her going far away, what did he mean? Ava looked back at the house, at the light still glowing in the window. "He meant he's been lying for 45 years, and he wanted us to know he knew we finally figured it out." Kovac let out a low breath. "Cold bastard." "Yeah," Ava said quietly. "He is." She stayed at the scene while the forensic team swept the house. They found nothing incriminating inside. No photographs, no trophies, no hidden evidence. Holloway had been careful, methodical. The only proof of what he'd done had been buried in a garage and hidden in a dead man's house. But it was enough. As Ava walked back to her car, snow began to fall. Light, delicate flakes that drifted down and melted on the pavement. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, weighted with memory. She thought about Emily Carter, walking down a street just like this one on a foggy October night in 1977. She thought about the silence that had followed, the years that had passed, the lives that had been broken by one man's decision. And she thought about Beck, who'd known something was wrong but hadn't lived long enough to see justice done. Ava got into her car, started the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the heater hum. Then she pulled out her phone and sent a message to the Aurelia Historical Society, where Beck's widow still lived. "We got him." Detective Beck was right. She hit send and drove away. By noon, the news had broken. Every major outlet in Ontario ran the story. Some led with the arrest, others with the cold case angle, but the headline was the same everywhere. Ontario 1977. Cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The broadcast played on a loop. Footage of Holloway being led out of his house, head down, cuffed hands in front. Interviews with Aurelia residents, some shocked, others claiming they'd always suspected. Photographs of Emily Carter, young, smiling, forever 24. And in a small apartment in Toronto, Ava sat on her couch, watching the coverage with the sound turned low. On the screen, a reporter stood outside the Barrie courthouse, snow falling gently behind her. After nearly half a century, the family of Emily Carter may finally have answers. Mark Holloway, now 77, has been charged with first-degree murder in connection with her 1977 disappearance. Investigators say DNA evidence and newly discovered materials led to the breakthrough. For the town of Aurelia, this arrest marks the end of a mystery that has haunted the community for generations. Ava muted the TV and leaned back, closing her eyes. She thought about the letter, sealed in plastic, waiting all those years. She thought about the scarf, buried beneath concrete. She thought about Emily and Samuel and all the secrets that had been kept in silence. And she thought about Mark Holloway sitting in a cell now, the weight of 45 years finally pressing down on him. The fog had lifted, the silence had broken, and the truth, painful, terrible, and long overdue, had finally come home. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, covering the streets in white, just like it had 45 years ago, just like it will always would. The news hit Aurelia like a shockwave. By the time the sun had fully risen on the day of Mark Holloway's arrest, the story had spread through every home, every shop, every corner of the small lakeside town. Phones rang. Neighbors gathered on porches. The diner on Main Street filled with people who hadn't spoken in years, all drawn together by the same disbelief. Mark Holloway, the mechanic who'd fixed their cars, the quiet man who'd lived among them for decades, the one who'd helped search for Emily Carter in 1977, who'd stood beside her grieving parents, who'd watched the town tear itself apart with suspicion, and said nothing. He'd been there all along, and no one had known. Ava returned to Aurelia 3 days after the arrest. She parked on Main Street and walked slowly through the town, observing the way people moved, tentatively, as if the ground beneath them had shifted. The fog still clung to the streets, but now it felt different, heavier, more oppressive. She stopped outside the diner and saw a small crowd gathered near the window, talking in hushed tones. When she stepped inside, the conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, some grateful, some angry. An older man at the counter, gray-haired and wearing a faded work jacket, spoke first. "You're the detective," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Ava said. The man shook his head slowly. "I brought my truck to him for 15 years. 15 years. He was always fair, always polite." His voice cracked. "How do you live with that? Knowing you shook hands with a man who—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. A woman seated nearby, Linda, the waitress Ava had met weeks earlier, set down her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. "We trusted him," Linda said quietly. "He was one of us. We defended him when people whispered. We told ourselves it couldn't be him. She looked up at Ava, tears in her eyes. How did we not see it? Ava sat down across from her. Because he made sure you didn't. People like Holloway, they're good at hiding. They blend in. They become the person you expect them to be. But for 45 years? Another voice said from the back. How do you carry something like that for 45 years? Ava didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure anyone did. Later that afternoon, Ava drove to the Aurelia cemetery. It was a small plot on the edge of town, surrounded by old oaks and overlooking the northern ridge. The headstones were weathered, some leaning slightly. Names and dates faded by time. She found the Carter family plot near the center, 3 headstones in a neat row. Helen Carter, 1932, 1995 Thomas Carter, 1930, 1995 Emily Jane Carter, 1953, 1977. Ava knelt in front of Emily's stone. The earth in front of it was sunken slightly, the grass thin and pale. Someone, probably a distant relative or a local historian, had left a small bouquet of dried flowers. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out the woolen scarf, carefully folded and sealed in clear plastic. She placed it gently at the base of the headstone. I'm sorry it took so long, Ava said softly. But we found you, and we found him. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. For a moment, the only sound was the faint creak of the trees and the distant call of a crow. Ava stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the cold grass, staring at Emily's name carved in stone. She thought about the young teacher who'd walked out of her house on a foggy October night, trusting that the world was safe. She thought about her parents, who'd waited by the window every night hoping for a daughter who would never come home. And she thought about the silence, 45 years of it, that had finally been broken. You never went far away, Ava whispered. You were here all along. That evening, Ava returned to Lake Kuching. The sun was setting, casting the water in shades of deep orange and violet. The fog was beginning to roll in the way it always did, curling over the surface like smoke. Ava stood at the edge of Cedar Street where Emily's house had once been and looked out over the lake. It was the same view Emily would have seen, the same mist, the same light, the same silence. Ava closed her eyes and let herself remember the case. Every piece of evidence, every interview, every sleepless night spent chasing shadows. And then she let herself imagine what it must have been like for Emily in those final moments. The fear, the confusion, the realization that someone she trusted had betrayed her. When Ava opened her eyes, the sun had dipped below the tree line, and the fog had thickened. She thought about Beck, standing in this same spot decades ago, staring at the same water, searching for answers he'd never find. And she thought about Holloway, sitting in a cell now, the weight of his silence finally collapsing in on him. The truth hadn't been lost. It had just been waiting. October 22nd, 1977. Emily Carter steps out of her house just after dusk. The fog is thick, the air cold. She pulls her jacket tighter and walks toward her car, keys in hand. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. The church bells ring faintly over the water. She doesn't see the man waiting. She doesn't know that in a few moments her life will end. She doesn't know that her name will echo through decades, unresolved, unfinished. But she walks forward anyway, trusting the world the way people do when they have no reason not to. And then, the fog swallows her. March 2023. Ava stands at the same spot, looking out over the same lake. The fog rolls in, slow and inevitable. The church bells ring in the distance. The wind carries the scent of pine and cold water. But this time, the silence feels different. This time, there are answers. Ava turned and walked back to her car. As she reached for the door, the church bells began to ring, 6 soft chimes echoing across the water, marking the hour. She paused, listening. The sound was the same as it had been in 1977. The same rhythm, the same tone. a continuity that stretched across decades, unchanged, unyielding. And in that moment, Ava understood something Beck must have known all along, that some truths are patient. They wait. They endure. They refuse to be buried forever. She got into her car and started the engine. As she drove out of Aurelia for the last time, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The town was disappearing into the fog, the lights from the houses blinking faintly like distant stars. She thought about Emily, and the scarf left at her grave, and the silence that had finally been broken, and she whispered into the quiet of the car. She never went far away. She was here all along. The news coverage continued for weeks. Mark Holloway was formally charged with first-degree murder and held without bail. His trial was scheduled for the following year. Forensic evidence, DNA analysis, and the Polaroid photograph were presented to the court. Legal experts called it an open and shut case. Holloway never spoke publicly. He never gave interviews. He never explained. He simply sat in his cell, silent as he'd always been, as if the weight of 45 years had finally crushed whatever words he might have had left. In Aurelia, life slowly returned to normal. The diner reopened. The church bells rang on time. The fog continued to roll in every evening, indifferent to human grief. But something had changed. People walked a little slower past the old garage on Forest Hill Road. They glanced at the spot where Emily's house had stood. They remembered. And every October, someone, usually Linda from the diner, sometimes a local teacher, occasionally a stranger passing through, left flowers at Emily Carter's grave, not because they'd known her, but because they knew her story, and they refused to let her be forgotten.
Ultimately, this story reminds us that persistence changes everything. Evidence doesn't vanish, it waits. It endures. It sits quietly in filing cabinets and sealed boxes, patient for the person who knows how to read it, who refuses to look away. In our world today, that means documenting thoroughly, preserving every detail, sharing information responsibly, and holding on to the belief that truth may move slowly, but it never stays silent forever. Emily Carter's story proves that no one truly disappears as long as someone is willing to search, as long as the evidence remains, as long as we refuse to forget. If you believe that every voice deserves to be heard, that every case deserves a second look, subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue this journey, exploring cold cases across North America, uncovering the stories that time tried to bury, and bringing light to the shadows that have lingered far too long. Thank you for following Emily Carter's story. See you in the next episode, where another town, another lake, may finally whisper its long-buried secrets.